When people conjure images of ancient enigmas, their thoughts often drift to places like Egypt's Great Pyramids or the monoliths of Stonehenge. Yet, right here in the heart of Indiana, long before the land was blanketed by cities and corn, vanished cultures erected strange earthworks, left behind forgotten settlements, and created artifacts that defy explanation. From colossal mounds aligned with celestial bodies to whispers of giant remains unearthed from the soil, the Hoosier State's past is far more profound and peculiar than most people imagine. These are the enduring puzzles that lie just beneath our feet. Near Evansville, alongside the Ohio River, you might drive past a tranquil piece of land that seems unremarkable at first. But nestled within this riverside scenery is one of the Midwest's most captivating and puzzling locations, Angel Mounds. This is not simply another historical marker with a plaque. It was once a bustling metropolis, the center of a formidable society that flourished for centuries before any European ever reached North America. Occupied between roughly 1000 and 1450 AD, this was a principal hub of the Mississippian culture, a civilization recognized for building immense earthen mounds, creating intricate communities, and engaging in trade across vast territories. In its heyday, the Angel Mounds community spanned more than 100 acres, an area comparable to 75 football fields. The entire settlement was encircled by a formidable wooden stockade fortified with bastions or watchtowers. This defensive design implies a concern for security, but it also hints at a stratified social order. There is a clear demarcation between the inside and the outside, suggesting that entry was not granted to everyone. Within these walls, archaeological work has revealed the imprints of numerous homes, storage facilities, open public squares, and, most stunningly, 11 large platform mounds. These were not mere heaps of earth. They were meticulously constructed, likely over generations, for specific functions. The majority featured flat tops that probably supported temples, ceremonial structures, or the residences of the ruling class. They served as both sacred and political focal points, rising physically above the rest of the inhabitants. The most prominent of these, known as Mound A, is enormous, stretching over 600 feet in length and standing 44 feet tall. Picture ascending its heights in that era, gazing out over the city's rooftops and gardens. For a leader or a spiritual authority, that elevation was more than just physical. It was deeply symbolic. You were positioned literally above all others. Surrounding these great structures were the common artifacts of daily existence. Archaeologists have found shards of pottery, tools made of stone and bone, and even items that appear to have been used for games or rituals. What is particularly compelling is the origin of some of these relics. Objects have been discovered that came from as far away as the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Plains, hundreds of miles from Indiana. This indicates that the residents of Angel Mounds were not living in isolation. They were linked into a far broader world, exchanging goods, sharing concepts, and likely absorbing knowledge from distant cultures throughout what is now the United States. Yet for all the physical clues we possess, a great deal remains unknown. The Mississippians left no system of writing, so we must reconstruct their narrative from the objects we unearth. And frankly, that narrative is riddled with holes. One of the most significant enigmas is why they departed. Around the year 1450, the city was suddenly deserted. There are no definitive signs of warfare, no evidence of a catastrophic fire, and no mass burial sites to point to a violent conclusion. Some scholars theorize that the society's collapse was triggered by environmental challenges, perhaps a succession of devastating floods or prolonged droughts that made agriculture untenable. Others propose that disease may have swept through or that a political implosion occurred. There is even a hypothesis that the population simply became too large for the land to sustain, with issues like soil depletion or overfarming making survival increasingly difficult. Then there are the mounds themselves. What precisely took place upon their summits? Were they utilized to observe the stars, like primitive observatories? Did priests or chieftains reside up there? Were rituals, perhaps even sacrifices, performed? It is difficult to know for certain. Nearby burial sites suggest a very rigid class hierarchy, with some individuals interred with precious goods, while others were buried with nothing, implying a society with pronounced social divisions. Despite decades of study, we are still left to speculate about many aspects of life at Angel Mounds. One individual who dedicated his life to these questions was Glenn A. Black, an archaeologist who commenced his work at the site in the 1930s. He devoted many years to excavating, recording, and attempting to comprehend this lost city. His efforts drew national focus to Angel Mounds, yet even he was unable to solve all of its riddles. Today, visiting the location is an experience that is challenging to articulate unless you have personally walked the grounds. A profound quietness pervades the area. Pathways meander through the grass, leading past mounds that still dominate the terrain despite centuries of erosion. A nearby interpretive center helps illuminate what we have learned about Mississippian life, but much of the site's power derives from simply being present within it. If you arrive in the early morning as fog clings to the fields and silence hangs in the air, broken only by the wind, you can almost envision the city stirring back to life. You might sense the rhythm of ceremonial drums, see smoke rising from cooking fires, and picture people moving through the plazas. It is as if the past is just beyond your grasp, palpable but untouchable. That is the essence of Angel Mounds. For all its mystery, it is not a folktale or a myth, it is tangible. The people who dwelled there were intelligent, well-organized, and deeply intertwined with their land and with one another. They constructed something magnificent, and then, for reasons we may never fully grasp, they walked away from it. Perhaps this is why it resonates so deeply. Angel Mound serves as a reminder that long before Indiana became a state, long before it was even named Indiana, this very land nurtured a sophisticated, advanced civilization. A society that emerged, prospered, and ultimately vanished, leaving behind only earthen traces, pottery fragments, and an overwhelming sense of wonder. It is easy to associate ancient civilizations with distant lands like Egypt, Greece, or Mesoamerica. But Angel Mounds stands as proof that incredible histories unfolded right here in the American heartland. We simply discuss them less. Even now, Angel Mounds has more to reveal. Perhaps with new research, advanced technology, or just a different perspective, we will unearth more pieces of this ancient puzzle. Until that day, it endures as one of Indiana's most compelling sites, a silent city of mounds clutching the secrets of its past. In the middle of the 19th century, an unusual object was unearthed near Newark, Ohio, a town roughly 200 miles from the Indiana border. It was not precious metal or ancient remains, but a collection of small, inscribed stones that would ignite a fierce storm of controversy and debate that persists to this day. These artifacts, now referred to as the Newark Holy Stones, were excavated from burial mounds linked to the same mound-building culture that once spanned a large portion of the Midwest, including Indiana. The find piqued the interest of all kinds of people, from archaeologists and theologians to skeptics and ardent believers. The initial object, and likely the most renowned, is known as the Keystone. It was discovered in 1860 by a man named David Wyrick, who had developed a fascination with digging into the Native American burial mound around Newark. During one of his digs, he found a small, dark, polished stone shaped somewhat like a plumb bob used for establishing a vertical line. This, however, was no mere tool. Each of its four faces bore inscriptions in Hebrew. The translated phrases included Holy of Holies, the Law of God, and the King of the Earth. Only a few months later, an even more complex artifact emerged, the Decalogue Stone. This object resembled a black sandstone tablet shaped like a curved headstone. At its center was a robed figure, possibly representing Moses, carved in relief and surrounded by a lengthy inscription in what appeared to be an archaic Hebrew script, seemingly outlining the Ten Commandments. If these artifacts were genuinely ancient, the implications would be staggering. The burial mounds they came for were constructed by the Hopewell culture, which flourished in this region from about 100 BC to 500 AD, well over a millennium before Columbus journeyed across the Atlantic. Thus, if the stones were authentic, it would imply that ancient Hebrew peoples had somehow reached North America, mingled with native societies, and left religious relics buried in their ceremonial grounds. It is the sort of theory that fires the imagination, and for some, it aligns perfectly with narratives of lost tribes, biblical journeys, and forgotten chapters of history. But this is where the situation becomes complicated. Mainstream archaeologists have consistently dismissed the stones as fraudulent. Almost immediately, scholars raise doubts about their origins, highlighting several inconsistencies. The style of the writing, for instance, does not align with genuine ancient Hebrew from biblical periods. Instead, it closely mirrors Hebrew fonts from the 19th century, the kind Weyrich might have encountered in books available during his time. Furthermore, the stones appear to be in remarkably pristine condition, lacking the expected weathering and damage for artifacts supposedly interred for over 1,000 years. Then there was Weyrich himself. His history included prior questionable discoveries, leading some to suspect he was either the architect of a hoax or had been duped by others. I am not definitively stating it was a fabrication, but the timing, the script style, and the rapid succession of discoveries do raise suspicions, particularly when you consider the historical context. Back in the mid-1800s, a prevalent belief among many settlers was that Native Americans were incapable of constructing the immense mounds found throughout the Midwest. This assumption, fueled by racial prejudice and a colonial mindset, gave rise to numerous alternative theories. People proposed the builders were anyone from Vikings and Egyptians to the lost tribes of Israel. The Newark Holy Stones fit seamlessly into this narrative. If someone wished to prove a biblical connection to the Americas or that the native mounds are the work of outsiders, these artifacts would have been exceedingly convenient. That being said, not everyone is convinced the Holy Stones were fakes. Some researchers contend that the precision, detail, and craftsmanship of the carvings indicate they were made with genuine intent, requiring considerable skill and perhaps even a deep knowledge of ancient languages. There are also proponents of the idea of ancient transatlantic contact, whether by Hebrews, Phoenicians, or another Old World civilization. Personally, I do not consider that concept impossible. History is filled with unexpected turns, and we are continually discovering how interconnected early societies might have been. However, I also believe in exercising caution. A theory is only as robust as the evidence supporting it, and at present, the stone's provenance is too dubious to be accepted without question. Still, I can appreciate their allure. There is a thrill in imagining ancient sea voyages across the ocean, long before mainstream history acknowledges them. In an era when people were grappling with new discoveries, these stones provided a compelling story, one that linked the new world back to the old. An interesting side note is that Indiana, while not the center of the newer finds, appears at the edges of this narrative. Some of the holy stones were held by private collectors in Indiana, and several Indiana-based antiquarians were vocal supporters of diffusionism, the theory that ancient cultures were shaped by transoceanic contact rather than developing in isolation. And like Ohio and Illinois, Indiana was once covered in earthen mounds, the vast majority of which have been lost to agriculture or construction. While nothing quite like the Newark stones has been found in Indiana, there have been whispers, 19th century newspaper articles, and old local tales of inscribed tablets, metal plates, and even so-called giant skeletons being found in Indiana soil. Most of these accounts are now seen as exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated. Yet, they reveal how eager people were, and perhaps still are, for a deeper, more enigmatic version of history. So, where are the Newark Holy Stones now? You can actually go see them. They are on display at the Johnson Humrick House Museum in Coshocton, Ohio. The museum avoids taking a definitive position on their authenticity, instead allowing visitors to form their own conclusions. I respect that approach. Presenting the evidence without forcing a narrative lets people engage with the larger questions themselves. Because ultimately, that is what the Newark holy stones embody. A question: how do we determine what is genuine in archaeology? When an object appears that disrupts the established timeline, do we dismiss it as a forgery? Or do we remain open to reconsidering what we believe we know? I doubt there is a simple answer. But the fact that these stones are still being debated more than 160 years later suggests they touch upon something real, perhaps not in a literal, historical sense, but in what they reveal about our human desire for meaning, connection, and narratives that bridge disparate worlds. Whether the holy stones are clever fakes, authentic anomalies, or something in between, they have become a part of the historical landscape. And for better or worse, they have ensured that the mounds of the Midwest continue to hold secrets worth pursuing. Toward the southern tip of Indiana, where the Wabash River bends to meet the Ohio, lies a stretch of quiet agricultural land that gives little indication of the history concealed within it. At first glance, you might not think much of it. Just open fields, the smattering of trees, and perhaps the distant sound of moving water. 2 centuries ago, however, this location commanded attention for an entirely different reason. The locals named it Bone Bank, and for a very good reason. Early settlers in the 1800s were constantly discovering bones, a great quantity of them. Human remains, animal bones, and pottery shards were sometimes scattered on the surface, while at other times they would cascade from the riverbank as the Wabash relentlessly eroded the land. Some of the skulls were reported to be unusually large, and some skeletons were found interred with tools, copper jewelry, or ceramic vessels. It was as if history itself was seeping from the ground, the riverbank bleeding artifacts from a forgotten world. But who were these individuals, and what became of their settlement? Over the years, archaeologists began to formulate a theory. The most widely held belief is that Bone Bank was once a significant village of the Caborn-Wellborn people, a late branch of the broader Mississippian culture that had once been dominant across the American Midwest and Southeast. They inhabited the lower Wabash Valley from approximately 1400 to 1700 AD, well after the decline of great Mississippian centers like Cahokia. These people continued to build mounds, though fewer and smaller than their predecessors. Their communities were more compact and localized, but they were no less significant. Bone Bank might have been one of their largest settlements. Situated on a bluff overlooking the Wabash River, the location provided natural defenses, fertile ground for farming, and crucial access to trade networks. From this vantage point, they could transport goods up and down the river, maintaining connections with other villages throughout the region. Artifacts recovered from the site over the decades suggest that Bone Bank was far from isolated. Items like shell jewelry from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes region, and exotic ceremonial objects made from materials sourced from afar have all been discovered there. These were not just simple farmers living in seclusion. This was a community connected to a larger network, a regional center with ties reaching far beyond the borders of modern-day Indiana. Yet today, nearly all of it has vanished. The river has been slowly and methodically erasing the site for more than a century. Early accounts from the 1800s tell of settlers carrying away cartloads of bones and pottery. Some of those artifacts found their way into museums, while others were kept by private collectors. There are even tales of local farmers grinding up skeletons to use as fertilizer, completely unaware or unconcerned that they were destroying one of the most vital archaeological sites in the entire Midwest. And this is the part that is truly difficult to accept. Very little professional archaeological work was ever conducted there. Our knowledge of Bone Bank comes mostly from scattered museum collections, personal correspondence, and a few field journals from the early 20th century. A handful of archaeologists attempted to investigate the area, but by the time they arrived, vast portions of the site had already tumbled into the river. Some early observers estimated that hundreds of individuals were buried at Bone Bank. Certain graves contained single individuals with thoughtfully placed offerings like tools, beads, and pottery. Others were much simpler. There were also reports of communal burials, possibly mass graves, which introduces even more questions. Was this a village devastated by an epidemic? Or was there some form of conflict, a raid, or battle, that resulted in hasty burials and clustered graves? We do not know. With so little of the site remaining for study, we may never have the answers. And then, of course, there is the folklore. During the 19th century, newspapers and local tales began circulating accounts of giant skeletons, men supposedly standing over 7 feet tall, buried with enormous stone axes and ceremonial artifacts. It is difficult to distinguish fact from hyperbole. Some of these reports were likely inflated over time, passed down by word of mouth, or sensationalized to sell newspapers. But these kinds of stories consistently appear in places where ancient mounds were disturbed, Indiana included. Personally, I believe some of those old accounts should be approached with skepticism, but not entirely disregarded. Sometimes, folklore contains a shard of truth, even if it has been embellished over time. If people were discovering unusually large bones or burial items that defied their expectations, they would have tried to make sense of it in any way they could. There are also peculiar reports of unusual burial practices, such as skeletons oriented in odd directions or indications that some bodies were interred with great haste. None of this provides a complete narrative, but it does paint a haunting picture of a village that may have experienced something sudden and catastrophic, leaving a permanent scar on the land. What is so frustrating is that Bone Bank never received the attention it so clearly merited. Unlike more famous locations such as Angel Mounds or Cahokia, Bone Bank quietly eroded into oblivion while most of the world was not paying attention. There is no historical placard, no conservation initiative, and no public entry. What little remains is situated on private property, and a significant portion of the original site has likely been claimed by the Wabash River or buried beneath farmland. But even in its nearly obliterated state, Bone Bank retains its importance. Had we been able to study it properly, it could have helped resolve key questions about the Midwest during the period between the fall of the major Mississippian cities and the arrival of European settlers. This was a pivotal transitional era in North American history, and Bone Bank was situated right at its heart. For me, what lingers is not just the mystery, but the lost opportunity. How many ancient villages like Bone Bank have vanished, unrecorded, washed away by rivers, or paved over by development before anyone had a chance to understand them? That is what makes sites like this feel so precious and vulnerable. They are finite and unique. Once they are gone, there are no do-overs, no second chances. And yet, in a peculiar way, Bone Bank continues to communicate. Every time a collector examines a potsherd in a dusty box or a museum curator catalogs a long-neglected bone, another small fragment of the story emerges. There may yet be tales buried in the mud of Posey County, small stories, perhaps, but significant ones. For now, the name Bone Bank is a specter of what once existed. No village, no fence, no signpost, just a name whispered on old maps and a river that never ceases its flow. But for those who care to look closer, it serves as a powerful reminder that Indiana's prehistoric past is deeper and stranger than most people could ever fathom. And somewhere beneath that soft earth and those quiet fields, something ancient is still awaiting our understanding. If you browse through old Indiana newspapers from the 19th century, you will discover something peculiar. Hidden among articles about farm prices and local news are reports of giants being excavated from ancient burial mounds. This is not a reference to basketball players. These accounts describe skeletons measuring 7, 8, or even 10 feet in length. And it was not just about large bones. These giants were supposedly interred with copper implements, stone axes as large as oars, and artifacts that did not align with what people understood of Native American history. The narratives typically follow a similar pattern. A farmer plowing his land stumbles upon a mound and unearths what appears to be a gigantic skull. News of the discovery spreads, and local residents gather to stare in amazement. Perhaps a self-styled antiquarian arrives on the scene, and then the bones disappear, either into a private collection, a museum storage, or simply vanishing without trace. Indiana has its own collection of such stories. These reports have emerged from places like Posey County, Knox County, along the White River, and near Anderson and Vincennes. Some of the more dramatic tales speak of skeletons with double rows of teeth, massive jawbones that could purportedly be worn as a mask, and skulls that were unusually elongated. So what is the truth behind all this? Are these simply old tales that got blown out of proportion, or did people genuinely find something extraordinary? Let's begin with what we know for certain. Indiana, like a significant portion of the eastern United States, was once the home of several mound-building societies, notably the Adena, the Hopewell, and later the Mississippians. These cultures constructed large earthen mounds used for burials, ceremonies, and possibly even tracking celestial events. When settlers arrived in the 1800s, they had little understanding of what they were encountering. To them, these were merely large, enigmatic piles of dirt, and tragically, many were dug into or flattened with little consideration. This is when the stories of giants began to surface, and for a time, they were reported as actual news. One can find 19th century articles and even some early Smithsonian documents that mention unusually large skeletons. However, as the field of archaeology grew more professional, the narrative began to change. Scientists started to dismiss these stories as misidentified remains, exaggerations, or outright hoaxes. Yet, not everyone was convinced. Over the decades, alternative researchers and enthusiasts of fringe history have kept the notion alive. Some propose that the skeletons belong to a forgotten race, perhaps one even older than the Adena. Others connect them to the Nephilim mentioned in the Bible, while a few speculate about ancient visitors from distant lands or even Atlantis. Mainstream archaeology does not endorse any of these ideas, but that has not stopped the theories from circulating. Now, to be fair, there are several plausible explanations for how these stories might have originated. First, there's the issue of misjudged measurements. In the 19th century, people lacked sophisticated tools like laser levels or forensic equipment. A few large bones protruding from soft ground could easily seem much larger than they actually were, especially if they were disarticulated or warped by time. Add a dash of local excitement to the mix, and suddenly you have a 10-foot giant. Second is the existence of tall individuals within native populations. Not every skeleton discovered in a mound belonged to someone who was 5'5". Taller people existed. Individuals over 6 feet were not typical, but they were certainly not unheard of. In an era when the average man stood under 5'7", a person buried at 6'4" with ceremonial regalia could easily appear gigantic. Third, there's the matter of skull deformation and dental anomalies. Some native cultures practiced cranial shaping, binding infants' heads to produce elongated skulls. This was a cultural practice, not evidence of anything otherworldly. Similarly, crowded or severely worn teeth could be mistaken for a double row by someone unfamiliar with dental pathology. Fourth, we have sensationalism and deliberate deception. This was also a golden era for outlandish headlines. Newspapers engaged in fierce competition, and a bizarre archaeological find could sell a lot of copies. 8-foot skeleton found in cornfield was far more captivating than more pottery shards found in mound. Still, even with all these potential explanations, the sheer volume of these stories gives some people pause, especially when considering that no comprehensive statewide investigation of these reports was ever conducted. Most of the original bones have been lost. A great number of the finds were never properly documented, particularly before formal archaeology became established in the 20th century. Some researchers suspect that certain findings were deliberately suppressed, not in the earth, but within bureaucracy. There are allegations that the Smithsonian gathered large bones in the 1800s but never conducted follow-up studies. Others claim the discoveries were lost because they did not conform to the prevailing narrative about who inhabited North America and when. Whether or not that is accurate, it certainly adds to the mystery. Of course, skeptics correctly point out that no verified skeleton taller than 7 feet has ever been officially documented from an Indiana mound using modern scientific standards. Until that occurs, the academic consensus is quite clear. The giants of Indiana are most likely a combination of tall individuals, misinterpretations, and good old-fashioned tall tales. So where does that leave us? For me, and I believe this is a reasonable middle ground, it is evident that something intriguing was happening. Whether it was misunderstood evidence, forgotten discoveries, or simply a great deal of cultural chatter, these stories carry significance. Even if the physical giants were never real, the legends themselves are. They have become woven into Indiana's historical consciousness. Folklore born from genuine curiosity during a time when people were discovering strange relics of the past in their own backyards. And let's be honest, mystery has always been a component of archaeology. Not everything is solved. Not every question receives a tidy answer. That is what makes history so compelling to explore. Today, the accounts of Indiana's giants persist, mostly in dusty newspaper archives and local lore. But if you ever find yourself wandering near an old mound, especially as evening approaches and fog begins to settle, it is not difficult to imagine one of those ancient giants still resting beneath the soil, waiting for the earth to shift once more. Just off the Wabash River near Vincennes, Indiana, there's an outcropping of limestone that appears unremarkable at first. You could easily walk by without noticing anything out of the ordinary. But if you pause, look intently, and allow your eyes to acclimate to the light and texture, something begins to take shape. Faint lines, peculiar patterns, forms that could be animals or something else entirely. These are the Vincennes petroglyphs, Indiana's quiet, deteriorating link to a prehistoric era. You will not find any road signs directing you to them. It is not a prominent tourist destination. In fact, most local residents have never even heard of the site. And yet, this fading piece of rock art may represent one of the oldest surviving forms of human expression in the entire state. That fact alone should make it significant. The carvings are etched directly into the soft limestone near the riverbank. This is not a sheltered cliff face or a protected cave wall, but exposed, weathered stone, susceptible to every downpour and flood that passes through. Over the centuries, erosion has softened the edges and faded the lines, making what remains difficult to decipher. But we know they are there, and we know they were not created by chance. The Wabash River has always been a vital artery. Long before the arrival of European settlers, it functioned as a major corridor for travel for indigenous peoples. If you envision the river as an ancient highway, it is logical that someone would have stopped here, perhaps to rest, to gather resources, or to commemorate something of importance. And if you wish to leave a message that would endure through the seasons, carving it into stone would have seemed like a durable option. As for what the carvings depict, that is where the situation becomes rather ambiguous. Some researchers have described geometric shapes, intersecting lines, simple animal figures, and abstract designs that are hard to categorize. Others perceive more symbolic imagery, perhaps of a spiritual or territorial nature. But the reality is that time has worn them down so severely that any interpretation is largely speculative. There is no definitive date associated with these rocks, but through comparisons with other sites in the region, some archaeologists suggest the carvings could date to the late woodland period, somewhere between 500 and 1000 AD. They might even be older. This would mean the creators could have been part of the same cultures that constructed burial mounds throughout Indiana and the Ohio River Valley, groups such as the Adena or the Hopewell. These were not just nomadic tribes. They were organized societies with extensive trade networks, complex ceremonial practices, and a profound understanding of their environment. So, why choose this particular spot to carve into stone? One theory is that this location was considered sacred. In many Native American belief systems, certain places possessed a special energy. Natural clearings, high elevations, riverbends. Petroglyphs were often created in such locations, not as random markings, but as components of rituals or spiritual narratives. A shaman might have carved symbols following a vision, a leader might have documented a significant event, or a traveler might have left a mark to request a safe journey. These were not mere decorations. They were messages, some intended to be understood, others not. Another hypothesis is that the Vincennes petroglyphs functioned as a type of map, perhaps not in a modern sense, but a symbolic one, indicating boundaries, routes, or community gathering places. If you were navigating the river, these symbols could have served as a way of saying, "You are now entering our territory," or "This is a place of peace." Petroglyphs in other parts of North America have been shown to serve these very purposes. There is even a chance that what we are observing is a story, a visual narrative conveyed through a series of carvings. This is a feature found in places like Utah, New Mexico, and even parts of Canada, where rock panels often depict figures engaged in activities like hunting, dancing, or traveling. In those traditions, the landscape itself becomes a storyteller, with each carved site representing a chapter. Could Vincennes have been one chapter in a much larger narrative? We do not know, and that is the core of the problem. We simply do not know. No major archaeological excavation has ever been conducted here. There has been no in-depth study, no preservation effort. The carvings were noted in early 20th century accounts by local antiquarians, but they were treated more as curiosities than as valuable cultural records. Today, the site remains formally unprotected. It is not fenced off or monitored, leaving it exposed to the elements and to anyone who might not treat it with respect. Consequently, what is left is vanishing quickly. Rain, ice, and fluctuating water levels are all gradually wearing away the past. Unlike an artifact that can be moved to a museum, these carvings are an integral part of the landscape. Once they are gone forever. This also raises a larger question. Were there more petroglyphs like these? Could there have been other rock panels along the Wabash that have been lost to time? It is not an unreasonable thought. The river's course has shifted, fields have been tilled, and roads have been built. We know that vast portions of Native American history in the Midwest have been erased, either intentionally or through neglect. So perhaps Vincennes is just one surviving piece of a much larger picture we will never get to see. And what makes this all the more frustrating is that Indiana is not particularly known for petroglyphs. In fact, they're quite rare in this part of the country. Most ancient cultures here express themselves in other ways, through earthworks, mounds, pottery, and oral traditions. Rock carving was not a common practice, which makes this site even more exceptional. It is an anomaly, a whisper from a time and culture we can barely comprehend. You would think that would be enough to ignite serious, scholarly interest. Instead, the Vincennes petroglyphs exist in a kind of historical purgatory, too worn to attract tourists, too obscure to secure major research grants, and too fragile to wait much longer. So, what should we do with something like this? Do we dismiss it as just another forgotten artifact? Or do we strive to preserve what remains, even if its meaning is lost to us? Here is my perspective, and I'm trying to remain balanced. We may never fully decipher what these carvings meant. We may never discover who created them or what they were attempting to communicate. But that does not render them meaningless. On the contrary, the very fact that someone centuries ago chose to carve into stone rather than wood or soil tells us something profound. It indicates that they wanted their message to endure. They believe it was important. And even if we no longer understand the language, perhaps the most respectful action we can take is to acknowledge that they had something worth saying. So, if you ever find yourself in southern Indiana, near the quiet outskirts of Vincennes, consider taking a detour. Seek out the limestone. Let your fingers trace the worn-out grooves. You will not find a plaque or a tour guide, but you might sense something else, a quiet link to the people who came before, people who try to speak across the ages. And maybe, just maybe, you will hear the faint echo of a story we are still struggling to understand. Just off the highway in Anderson, Indiana, lies a serene expanse of land that most people drive by without a second thought. It is green, wooded, and tranquil, a typical Midwestern state park. Yet contained within this unassuming landscape is something genuinely ancient and profoundly mysterious, the Anderson Mounds. I understand that the word mounds might not sound thrilling, but when you grasp what they are and how long they have existed, it tends to change your perspective. These are not merely hills. They are man-made earthworks, constructed with astounding precision by the Hopewell people more than 2,000 years ago. This predates Columbus, the pyramids of Chichen Itza, and even the peak of the Roman Empire. And they are still here, sculpted into flawless circles and long earthen ridges, concealed in plain sight. The focal point of the site is known as the Great Mound. As you approach it, you begin to sense its significance. This is not a haphazard pile of dirt. It is intentional. The mound creates a massive circular embankment nearly 400 feet in diameter, with a broad entrance cut into one side. If you position yourself in the center and peer through that opening at sunrise on the summer solstice, you will witness something remarkable. The sun aligns perfectly with the gap. This is not a coincidence. This is the aspect that truly resonates with me. The Hopewell builders were not just moving Earth. They were creating a place that was synchronized with the cosmos. This reveals that they were observing the sun and moon, likely for many years, learning to measure time through the movement of light. For them, this mound may have been a combination of a sacred space, a calendar, and a gathering spot. It is akin to a blend of Stonehenge and a natural amphitheater, fashioned from earth by hand using only simple implements. Inside the Great Mound, there's a raised platform that archaeologists believe was used for ceremonies or rituals. Post holes have been discovered here, indicating that wooden structures likely once stood within the circle, perhaps a temple, a lodge, or another building of spiritual importance. But with no written language left behind, no one truly knows what was spoken or performed within those circles. This leaves a great deal to the imagination, but also instills a deep sense of respect. You are observing something that people constructed with profound purpose, and whatever that purpose was, it was significant enough to be aligned with the sun. Throughout the park, there are 10 mounds in total. Some are small, others are long ridges, and one is uniquely shaped like a figure 8, which is especially rare for sites of this kind. We do not fully comprehend the meaning behind the different shapes. Were they symbolic, ceremonial, or practical? Perhaps they were all three, but it is clear this was not a casual undertaking. These people possessed a clear vision, and they executed it. One thing we do know is that the Hopewell were not isolated. Artifacts discovered around these mounds demonstrate that Anderson was part of an immense trade network. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, mica from the Appalachians, and copper from the Great Lakes have all been found here. This means people journeyed to this location, bringing goods, stories, and possibly beliefs from all corners of ancient North America. Imagine the kind of energy that must have animated this area during ceremonies or gatherings. The sound of drums, the flicker of firelight, songs reverberating through the trees. All long gone, but once vivid and real. And then, seemingly in an instant, it ceased. By approximately 400 AD, the Hopewell culture began to wane. No one is certain why. Climate change, political upheavals, or disease could all have been contributing factors. Whatever the cause, people stopped coming. The mounds were abandoned. Trees reclaimed the land, and the earthen rings were gradually forgotten. When European settlers arrived in the 1800s, they came across the mounds and were unsure what to think of them. Some believed they were constructed by a lost civilization, even linking them to ancient Egyptians or mythical giants. This was a popular theory at the time, rooted more in fantasy than in fact, but it illustrates how much mystery still enveloped the place. It was not until the 20th century that archaeologists began to study the mounds in earnest. During the Great Depression, workers from the Works Progress Administration, WPA, helped to map and preserve the site. Eventually, the land was designated as Mount State Park. Today, it is a public area. You can walk the paths, stand within the mounds, and watch the sunrise just as the Hopewell did. There are a few interpretive signs and a small nature center offering some information, but for the most part, it remains a peaceful location. You might see a jogger, a family enjoying a picnic, or perhaps no one at all. And in some ways, that tranquility enhances the experience. Here is my perspective. I believe that places like the Anderson Mounds are important, not just for what they were, but for what they continue to be. They serve as a reminder that long before our highways and housing developments, people were observing the sky, marking the passage of time, constructing monuments, and connecting with others across vast distances. They were not living in isolation. They possessed science, art, and spirituality, all without documenting it in the way we do. And I think that is part of what makes this site so powerful. There is no stone inscription or ancient tablet to tell us what occurred here, only earth shaped with intention, holding on to a mystery. If you ever have the opportunity to visit, go early, perhaps even during a solstice if you can. Stand in the center of the Great Mound. Absorb the stillness. Watch the sun emerge through that ancient gateway. You will likely find yourself pondering the same questions people have asked for generations. Who were these people? Why did they build this? And what did it mean to them? We may never have all the answers, but perhaps that is acceptable. Maybe the goal is not to solve the mystery, but to feel it, because something about these silent circles of earth and sky still communicates, even today. If you travel to the far northwestern corner of Indiana, it might not seem like much at first. Flat farmland, scattered woods, and the slow-moving Kankakee River meandering through it all. It is a peaceful, quiet landscape, but if you know what to look for and understand what once stood here, you begin to see that this land holds a profound, almost erased story. Long before this region was part of Indiana, before the farms, roads, and drainage systems, this area was a vast wetland. Swamps, marshes, and dense forests stretched in every direction. It might seem an improbable location for a settlement, but it was, in fact, one of the most vibrant and significant regions in prehistoric Indiana. This is because the Kankakee River was not just a lazy stream. It was a primary artery for trade, travel, and cultural exchange. Thousands of years ago, this area was home to a network of mounds, seasonal camps, and village sites that were used by native peoples for countless generations. The Kankakee River flows into the Illinois River, which in turn connects to the Mississippi, effectively making it part of an ancient superhighway. People could transport goods, ideas, and narratives from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. We know there was a thriving presence here because early settler accounts from the 1800s and early 1900s describe dozens of low mounds and other evidence of past civilizations. Locations like Hebron, La Crosse, and English Lake were peppered with these earthworks. Some were burial mounds, while others appear to be more ceremonial or defensive in nature, often encircled by ditches or embankments. Many contain burials with red ochre, pottery fragments, stone tools, and even copper artifacts, which must have been transported over great distances to end up here. But here is the challenge. Nearly all of it has disappeared. In the effort to convert Indiana's wetlands into arable land, massive drainage projects were initiated in the late 1800s. The Kankakee Marsh, once one of the largest wetlands in the United States, was drained, plowed, and completely altered. In the process, many of the mounds were obliterated. Some were leveled by farmers who had no inkling of their significance. Others were plundered for artifacts. Some of these objects made their way into dusty museum collections, while others were likely discarded or lost forever. For archaeologists today, this loss is incredibly frustrating. There was very little formal excavation and insufficient time to document what was present before it vanished. It is like reading the first page of a fascinating book only to discover that the remaining chapters were tossed into a fire. Still, we have some clues. The artifacts that were recovered, along with pottery styles and tool types, indicate that the Kankakee region was utilized by various groups over an extensive period. The Hopewell culture likely passed through or established settlements here between 100 BC and 500 AD. Later, Algonquian-speaking peoples, including the ancestors of the Potawatomi and Miami, probably used the area for seasonal hunting and gathering. The river and its surrounding wetlands provided everything they needed: fish, wild edible plants, birds, and shelter. But it was more than just a hunting ground. The existence of mounds and evidence of repeated occupation suggest something more permanent. People likely returned to this area year after year, possibly for generations. Some researchers believe it served as a regional meeting point, a trade hub, or even a ceremonial gathering place where different groups could interact peacefully. And there is more. Some of the pottery styles discovered in this region exhibit a fusion of local designs with external influences from the Mississippi Valley, the Great Lakes, and even farther south. This suggests that the Kankakee was not an isolated backwater. It was a connected, integral part of a much larger network of ancient North American cultures. Local folklore only deepens the mystery. Early settlers recounted finding bark-wrapped burials, unusual stones, and occasionally very large bones, contributing to the persistent legend of giants interred in Midwestern mounds. While there is no definitive scientific proof of actual giants, these stories appear so frequently in old reports that it makes one wonder what early farmers truly witnessed when they turned over the soil in their fields. Tragically, almost none of the mounds survive today. You might encounter a subtle rise in a field or a line of trees that seems insignificant, but it could be concealing what is left of a burial site. Some local residents still discover arrowheads, scrapers, or pottery fragments after a heavy rain, tiny remnants now hinting at what once existed. Unlike preserved sites like Angel Mounds or Mound State Park, the Kankakee Mounds were mostly erased before anyone had the chance to study them properly. It has become a quiet mystery, the kind that does not capture headlines, but instead lingers just beneath the surface, quite literally. And it raises a difficult question: what have we lost? This was not just a handful of burial mounds or scattered campsites. It may have been an entire regional culture, bound together by water and trade, with its own unique traditions, ceremonies, and deep knowledge of the land. And now, most of it lies beneath soybean fields, with only fragments and echoes left behind. You do not need a massive monument to feel the gravity of that loss. Even hearing someone say, "My grandfather found bones in that field," or "We used to collect arrowheads down by the river," is enough to stir something within you. It is a reminder that beneath the surface of our everyday world, there is a deeper layer, a world that existed long before us and left behind only the faintest of traces. There is still an opportunity to learn more. A few archaeologists are attempting to map and identify what remains. Some local landowners are working to conserve small parcels of land they believe were once part of the ancient village areas. It is slow, painstaking work, but it is not impossible. And the more attention we devote to places like this, the more likely we are to protect what is left. In the end, the story of the Kankakee Mounds is not solely about what we have lost. It is also about what we choose to remember, about whether we are willing to listen to the land, even when it whispers instead of shouts. And perhaps, just perhaps, some of those whispers still carry the echoes of the people who once called this river home.